Yes.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, so my name is Jessica Ruijsch, and I'm very happy that got an invitation to present here. I'm currently a postdoc at Ghent University at the Hydroclimate Extremes Lab, where I work basically on the impact of deforestation on moisture recycling, which is why I'm here. But I only started in September, so I don't really have a lot of results on that yet. And before that, I was a PhD at Wageningen University. And yeah, so I will mainly present this today. And I will present some research on the biophysical climate effects of land restoration in Africa. Um, I will go over it a bit quickly or broadly because I only have limited time. But yeah, if you have any specific questions after it, just let me know. So, why do we care about this? So, the African continent is already experiencing the impacts of climate change and land degradation, and this has an impact on things like agriculture or biodiversity or the general livelihood of the population. And there are some organizations that recognize this and they propose a solution of land restoration. And this can be things like tree planting or area protection, natural regeneration. And quite often these projects aim to, for example, increase biodiversity or combat land degradation, but also quite often they aim to store anthropogenic carbon emissions. And through this, they can kind of impact the global climate. But what's often not considered is that due to the changes in vegetation cover, the land restoration project can also very directly impact the local climate. And what do I mean by this? So if you look at it very simply, is that if the incoming solar radiation at low vegetation cover is brought back through to the atmosphere in the form of mainly the sensible heat flux and the latent heat flux, which is used for evaporation and the transport of heat. And under high vegetation cover, so if you increase the vegetation cover, this works similarly. But if you usually there's some differences, and mainly the higher vegetation cover has a lower albedo, which means more solar radiation is absorbed. You often get a higher local temperature, and this process is often referred to as albedo warming. But at the same time, an increase in vegetation means often more evaporation, and therefore a less more energy goes into that evaporation, so you get a bit of a cooling. And this is often referred to as evaporative cooling. And this process varies a bit from place to place. For example, in the more northern latitudes, you have usually a stronger albedo warming, and in more tropical regions, you have usually a bit higher evaporative cooling. And in addition to that, is that these changes in the energy balance can also impact things like boundary layer growth and cloud developments. And because we are at a moisture recycling seminar, this also links to moisture recycling because this change in cloud formation and precipitation can also lead to changes in moisture recycling and also even feedbacks to vegetation. So it's kind of a starting point if you think about land cover change. So we know kind of that these different processes exist, but we don't really know how to apply them to land restoration projects, which are often relatively small, and especially in the African context. So I try to study how land restoration projects in Africa impact the local climate through these biophysical processes. I mainly did this through Earth observation. So I looked at how restoration impacts vegetation greenness and then the land surface temperature, which kind of represents the surface energy balance. And I also looked at cloud formation. And I did this with satellite data, but I also looked at atmospheric modeling for this last part. So how do we do this, I used MODIS data and mainly the NEVI, which represents vegetation greenness. And you can basically look at a time series over, for example, the past 20 years and see if you have at the location of a restoration project, you see an increase in vegetation greening. But the problem is that this vegetation is not only impacted by restoration activities, but also by things like natural climate variability. And we want to separate that. So we did that by assuming that the natural climate variability acts on a bit of a larger scale. So if you have a certain restoration project, and the change in vegetation would be due to, for example, more rainfall, then you would expect that this change in vegetation cover also happens outside of this project. So what we did on the continental scale, we looked at each point, do we see an increase in vegetation greenness over time? And I kind of call this local greening. You see that these local greening pixels mainly occur in like semi-arid regions across Africa. And then I looked, do we see this local greening at places where we know that land restoration happens? And this was kind of a challenge because there are not a lot of open source database with land restoration projects. So I used this WOCAT database, which contains sustainable land management projects. And I compared the amount of greening pixels inside these projects compared to a reference region. And what we see in this graph is the fraction of greening pixels. And a problem with this database is that it only contains a point coordinate, not really the actual region. So I just looked at different radii around this point. And then we see that for all these land management projects, we see a higher amount of greening than a reference region. And if we look at the subset of data, so we looked at revegetation, which is the active planting of vegetation, then we see a bit of a larger amount of greening, but mainly on smaller regions. And for natural regeneration, which is usually something like area protection so that you can let the vegetation grow by itself, we see vegetation greening mainly for larger regions. So as the next step, we want to see how this change in vegetation greenness impacts the land surface temperature. And for this, we also used MODIS data, and we applied a similar methodology. So we looked if a region is greener than its surroundings, will it be either cooler or warmer than its surroundings? And again, this is kind of to account for these changes in the natural climate. So here you see an example of a certain location. So you see a time series of NEVI in green and the LST in blue, and then at a certain point compared to its surroundings. And then you can use these kind of relationships to make a prediction of the local cooling potential of land restoration, which you see in the map on the right. So I first made a map of potential NEVI, which you see here. And this mainly how large the NEVI could be given the certain climate constraints. So it doesn't really take into account anything like, oh, we need space for agricultural cities or things like that. But it's more how much vegetation this specific region can have. And then we use this map and the kind of relations that we derived earlier to make a sort of prediction on local cooling which could be achieved due to land restoration. And you see that quite a large region within Africa results in local cooling, which means that a greener region is cooler than a nearby non-green region. And we expect this mainly due to this evaporative cooling. But we also see regions, for example, these drier regions, where you see local warming. And it's quite hard to exactly pinpoint a mechanism behind this because there are not a lot of like energy balance observations, but we expect that this is because there's not a lot of water in these regions to sustain a large evaporative cooling, and then this albedo warming kind of becomes more important. So as the next step, we looked at cloud formation, and we used meteoset data for this. So we looked at different green regions, and we looked, are there more or less clouds in this region? And why do we want to know this? Because basically clouds need, if you look at it simplistically, they need two important things. So it needs moisture to form, which comes from the evaporation, but they also need the heat to make the moisture rise to a level where it can condensate. And in theory, you see regions where you have increase in cloud formation over vegetated regions, but there are also regions where you see a bit of less cloud formation because most of the energy, or it is a bit cooler, for example, so you don't have enough heat to bring this moisture to a certain level of condensation. So we used the meteoset high resolution visible band, which is a 1 kilometer resolution band, and it has a 15 minutes temporal resolution and about 20 years of data. So you can imagine that's quite a lot of data. So we zoomed into West Africa for this. So you see parts of Nigeria and Benin and Niger, Burkina Faso. And this region has quite a lot of protected areas, which you see highlighted in green at the top. And with this higher resolution meteoset data, you can really see that over some days you see actually cloud formation over these protected regions compared to surrounding regions. But of course, you want to know it a bit more statistically. So for each HRV image, I created a cloud mask with an algorithm that was previously used for France for this same data. And it's a bit of a simple algorithm, and it just looks at the surface or the reflectance of the image, and it compares it to the cloud-free image. So brighter regions have more clouds. And for this region, it works relatively well. And with the data, we can kind of make an estimate of the effect of these protected areas. So in this graph, you see the difference in cloud cover frequency on the y-axis between these project regions and a buffer region around it. And you see that for the smaller regions, which are on the left side of the graph, there's not really a significant increase in cloud cover frequency. So there's not a significant difference in cloud development over these smaller projects compared to surrounding regions. And only over projects larger than roughly 10 by 10 kilometers, we see a positive increase. And to dive a bit deeper into the effect of these patterns on cloud formation, we used the WRF model. And we kind of did two analyses. And the first step was to see a bit how restoration or vegetation can impact clouds. So which properties of the areas are important for this. And in the second step, we ran different scenarios of land restoration patterns and looked at the cloud formation. We did this for a domain which was also in the previous region. So this is quite a big protected region. And we did a sensitivity analysis by changing the albedo, the soil moisture, and the surface roughness in this protected region. And then here you see a lot of plots, but on the background you see a satellite image of this region. So you see a bit of a region with a higher vegetation cover than surrounding regions. And then you see here 3 different values of the albedo, so a decreasing albedo. And you see 3 different values of surface roughness, and then the rows are different values of soil moisture. And we actually saw that if you decrease the albedo, you get a higher cloud cover due to you have a warmer boundary layer, which promotes this rising of the air. But we also saw that if we increase the soil moisture, we get a lot less cloud formation. And this was because we don't really have this strong convection with a wetter soil. And these are the results of the different land restoration scenarios. So in green, you see kind of a forest land cover, and yellow, a grassland. And we used basically three variables that we changed to create random patterns. So you see three different values of forest cover, and then three different values of spatial clustering. So the rows, they have the same amount of forest cover, but they are just more spread or more clustered. And then we have three different random patterns with these same characteristics. And you actually see that if you cluster the forest more, that we saw a higher amount of cloud development for these specific days. Well, as you spread the forest more in a homogeneous way, we got a lot less cloud development. But it's good to know it's not in this figure, but we also did like a run with no forest at all and 100% forest. That all these scenarios with a bit of forest, they have a higher cloud formation than if you have only grassland. But apparently, if you cluster these more, you get a higher cloud formation. And why is this? Here you see a bit of a schematic overview. We actually saw that under these more scattered or small scale forest patches, the boundary layer is actually quite homogeneous. So, well, if you have these sharp contrasts between forest and grassland, then you've got a sharp sharp jump also in the boundary layer, which caused a sort of small scale circulation, which promoted cloud formation, especially at the boundaries between the forest and grassland, which you also see here. Yeah, so during all these steps, we kind of saw that the land restoration can increase the vegetation greenness and also impact the land surface temperature and cloud cover. But of course, there are a lot of unanswered questions. For example, how does this impact then rainfall and moisture recycling or even water availability? And this is then impact the vegetation again in this restored area or outside of this? Or does this help to adapt people to climate change? And what's the impact of biodiversity, for example? So there are a lot of questions still to be answered, but I hope that I provided some insights into this. All this research is published. So if you're interested in it, I think you can find it through this QR code. Let me know if you have any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.